So, hey everyone, I am Nick, and here is my special guest star, Shane. We are maintainers on Gateway API, and we are here to give you an update on what's happening in Gateway API that other parts of Kubernetes might care about. I thought I'd be a little literal with the title. Okay, so our agenda is what we're doing about versioning and releases, what we're doing about conformance and conformance profiles, policy attachment, and ReferenceGrant moving to a core API. Shane is going to take the first two. Over to you, man.
Yeah, so we're kind of expecting that people who are here kind of know what Gateway API is. The short version is the successor to Ingress. If you don't know, you can catch up with us later, like out in the tables and stuff. We'd be happy to give you more details, but just so you know, there's a little bit of expected knowledge there. So given that, we do versioning and releases kind of uniquely.
I did forget to say, we're kind of expecting that people might have questions with this one. Please feel free to interrupt us, like I just did to Shane. Sorry, Shane.
Oh. Yeah, and put up your hand anytime if you have questions. We're up for interrupting questions. So yeah, we do things a little bit differently. We actually have what we call, we have CRDs, V1 and Alpha 1, Beta 1. We're working on V1s, which hopefully will be out this year. But we have bundle versions, which come with your CRDs, conformance tests, and a validation webhook. And then we have release channels on top of these. So basically 2 different bundles. You can get a standard bundle or an experimental bundle, which I think is completely unique throughout the SIGs. And this has been very helpful for us to be able to get new content in fast without it being disruptive and stuff like that, and give it time to soak. So I think, yeah, basically this just kind of gives an idea that the standard channel is where our core, what people are going to be using in production is ultimately going to be. Experimental is kind of outside of that. So if somebody wants to, it's basically just separate sets of actual YAML. Like we have 2 different customized YAMLs you can use, standard or experimental. The experimental will come with additional features, like additional fields on the actual APIs and stuff like that that we're testing out. And then in time, I don't know if this is actually on the next slide, let me check. Yeah, so in time, we have a process for getting something into standard through experimental. And generally speaking, this is the process we'd like everything to kind of go through. Some things might go straight into standard if they're more obvious, but for the most part, you'll head into experimental. We'll take some time, see if it's working, see if implementations are enjoying it and it's working out for them, get conformance tests going, make sure all the implementations can do the conformance tests, and then just kind of keep evaluating it. So there's a cycle of evaluation where you can see here in the middle, it'd be like, is this working out? Is it helpful? No, maybe we throw it away, or yes, but we're not quite ready to move it on to standard. And then we'll keep going through that experimental cycle. Eventually, if something is working, there are multiple conformant implementations, it'll graduate onto standard. So it's a little, we also just do like the normal APIs, where basically we go through V1, Alpha 1, all the way to V1. We have already exercised V1 Alpha 2 for ourselves, so this beginning of the cycle is something that we are really, we think is really important to be able to go through an alpha cycle where we move quickly, we iterate, but ultimately make those breaking changes, eventually make it to V1 Beta 1, see if there's anything left that needs to be done that's breaking, and then make its way to V1. This is kind of different from at any stage here, you can have experimental features on top of that. So these APIs can have all the standard fields and stuff like that, but in theory, there's experimental fields at any of these API version stages.
It's probably also worth mentioning that because we are a core Kubernetes API delivered with CRDs, each one of these hops requires a Kubernetes API review. So it's actually pretty expensive in terms of extremely busy people's time. So we try not to do it without good reason.
Yeah, we were the first core API that I think we were the first core API that's out of tree. In tree is maybe a consideration, but I think we're probably going to stay out of tree because there's a lot of advantages to that, including how this goes. Where was I? All right. So yeah, this has been going pretty well. We are, however, thinking about dropping beta. So the beta hasn't really felt as useful to us. That part of the process hasn't really felt super useful. It seems like most of the initial stuff and like the breaking changes and stuff get hashed out in alpha, and then beta just kind of becomes GA. So, so we're kind of considering whether or not we actually need to have that step. And you might see that getting dropped in the future. It's an active conversation. We'd love to have you join that conversation and you know, tell us reasons why maybe we shouldn't drop it. We think we can do this because we're very, very careful about backwards compatibility and additive changes. Again, we're core APIs, so we do go through the normal like SIG network review process. And removing V1 Beta 1 just saves us a lot of time. We're basically kind of get stuck in kind of like, should we move forward kind of stage with beta for a while. It ultimately ends up getting adopted by people in production, and then it just becomes this dance of like, is it really beta? So before we do this, we plan on graduating everything that is in beta out, and that is going to take some time. So that's not happening super, super soon, but potentially as early as this year or maybe next.
Before we head on, yeah, does anyone have any questions about that? Yo, I thought we would. Okay, cool. Thanks, Joey.
So just a basic comment. We're very adamant with our users to never use an alpha feature. So from a testing perspective, I would be a little bit concerned that there may not be community involvement in some of the testing with alpha, or as widespread of testing. So just something, I don't know if you've already thought of that or not.
Yeah, okay, thanks, that's really valuable.
Yeah, and to put a finer point on it, just so if I didn't make the point clear earlier, nothing gets out of alpha without having extensive conformance tests. Conformance is like a #1 priority for us, and that conformance has to be hit by at least a few implementations, like multiple implementations have to be passing those conformance tests. And I'll talk more about conformance in just a second.
Yeah, I think just to build on that question, if you go back to your previous slides where we were showing the workflow.
This one?
Yeah. One of the questions I had is the remove from API part, right? Have you ever done that before? Have you actually got feedback and then ended up like this is useless?
Yep. So I think, yeah, that one was yours.
Mine.
Yeah.
I removed it.
Yeah.
So I introduced something for layer 4 routing last year. We spent some time with it in alpha and then put it through SIG network review, decided overall that it was something we might want to do in the future, but we didn't have enough implementations that cared about it, so we removed it. What was that? Was that port-based?
No, it was IP allow on block lists. For
IP allow block lists. We kind of thought it was a cool idea, but nobody really wanted to implement it or had any, like we didn't have any implementers, so we didn't think we'd put it in.
Yeah, and the other question was actually that, how do you get implementers? Because you say it has to be conforming for the graduation, but people are hesitant to implement V1 Alpha 1 because it's not stable really. So there's that chicken egg problem that we have. And
I mean, yeah, I think one of the things we've been trying to do that the sort of the alpha name doesn't communicate very well is that we're really, really, really careful about only making non-breaking changes as far as possible. I would say that for all of our alpha implementations at the moment, most of them are at least in a place where we shouldn't need to make any more breaking changes. Like we're pretty confident. The only reason we're talking about doing this is that the alphas are, effectively betas, right? Like that we're not. It's very unlikely at this point that we would need to make serious breaking changes to the core sort of the stuff that's already in there, and that's the only reason why we're thinking about doing this. For the three of us, the API conventions and API changes docs are our Bible when it comes to non-breaking changes, and so yeah, and we try very hard to sort of make sure we hit those things.
Yeah, and like UDP and TCP route are in alpha, and they've been that way for a long time. They haven't changed much. The thing we're waiting on, the only reason that they're not in beta right now is because we need multiple conformant implementations. But like they're not in flux, and they're very simple APIs.
Yeah. For TCP route and UDP in particular, there's two parts that we need, right? Multiple implementations and multiple implementations that are conformant. For that, we need conformance tests, which we currently don't have many of. Like Shane's working on that.
I'm working on it.
Yeah. You can hear about that in a minute. Yeah.
thank you. And the last remark I actually had was that around dropping the beta 1. If you look at your diagram here, Yeah, the remove from API 1, right? Like that's happening in alpha 1. If you remove that beta, there's going to be that danger where...
Yeah.
Just a remark, not...
Yeah, no, I think
Thank
it's
you.
completely fair feedback that is very much on our mind. Lucas,
Yeah. That's why we're not sure we're doing it.
yeah, we literally wanted to mention it now so that we could have people tell us that sort of stuff, right? So, yeah.
So one clarification on the kind of experimental and stable channels. So you have, did I understand it correctly that it's the CRDs they are two different CRDs?
Yes. So there are two different custom resource definitions, like one of which, both which have the same group and kind and version, and the experimental ones just have more fields in them, right? And so, but again, the only reason we can get away with that is because all of those fields that are added are additive changes that are backwards compatible, that you can round trip between the experimental one and the standard one, and you can write code that uses the experimental go structs and deserialize standard CRDs into it safely, because the zero value does nothing for all of the experimental fields. That's the only reason we can get away with this, is that we are ridiculously careful about that.
Okay, so with the controller, the Go binary controller that is in there, is it expected that it's the same? So when you have an implementation, it is expected that they use the kind of fully populated Go struct and then kind of just ignore the fields, or like either ignore the fields if they are not.
The intent is that you can use the experimental versions of the Go structs and have those fields in your code. And then if people use the standard version of the CRD in their cluster, then those paths will just never be used. Right, so that's the reason why it's like experimental, is that it lets implementations, this is our attempt to replicate what you get in the API server with feature gates, so that the feature gate is installing the experimental version or the standard version. But we've done our best to make it so it's as safe as we can make, in the same way that you have in the API server when you turn on a feature gate. If you turn it back off again, then the behavior should be safe as far as we can tell.
Right. So if a user is on the stable channel and then they apply some random YAML manifest from GitHub which uses experimental feature, they will get a strict error because it's an unknown field, or it will be just dropped by the API
No,
server?
so because if they are applying a stable object, it can't use any of the fields that are in the experimental object, so those will just be missing fields, so it'll be fine. If you try and apply an experimental fields onto a cluster that has the stable, then you will get a validation failure, but that's the only time you'll get a validation failure. If you go from experimental to stable and back to experimental, then maybe, I can't remember, the storage version thing gets a little complicated there, depends on if you've read it or not, but it's the safest that we can do while still being able to make additive changes and sort of have people able to implement them. So I think there was a few people who had comments on that. Yeah, we're using a bit of time on this, but I think it's probably worth it. Yeah.
Okay. I'd just like to, first of all, re-echo what you're saying about not using alpha features, because we've had many things in the past. Like we've got blanket rule now. Alpha we just cannot touch. Cause too many issues. Beta is also absolutely disabled for us, although those are the sorts of things that we kind of do individual reviews and would actually analyze it to see. The only other thing I was going to say about in the upstream world with beta is, because there's a guarantee that it still exists, it also enables rollback. So if you go from, obviously it's very dependent on what you're actually doing. So in the case of this one place, it might make sense, but the other meaning there is that we can roll back from V1 or to something with V1 beta 1 and expect it to still be there. With CRDs, it might be a little bit blurrier because you're managing that manifest separately, but
Yeah, and I think that's the only reason why we're sort of talking about it, I think Rob, it's Rob's proposal, so it's probably fair that we give him a chance to talk about it.
Defend it, Rob.
Yeah, so thank you. High level, the idea is take the alpha, beta, GA terminology away and focus on the idea of release channels. Our idea is that largely there are two concepts. There's enabled by default and therefore stable, and not enabled by default and therefore experimental. So we have a standard channel that most people use, an experimental channel that is something that you opt in for and recognize could break. Anything in between doesn't really add a lot of value. We have three different things, in Upstream. We have alpha, beta, GA, and beta is getting to the point where it's no longer enabled by default. But I feel like at least when you're managing your own CRDs, that provides very minimal value. You either have something, it's enabled by default and it's stable, or it's not and it's experimental. So trying to simplify that, and we'll all be around. We can continue this discussion afterwards.
Yeah. I think the one more thing that I want to say here, though, is Lucas and I literally had a conversation yesterday at Regex with some folks who tried to do their own CRDs and really had a lot of problems with it. So I want to open the question of maybe the time is right to consider a CRD development experience working group. If people are interested in talking about that, talk to me about it, and we'll see if we can get this thing off the ground. Because I think this is exactly the sort of thing that a working group like that would be able to talk a lot about. So anyway, we've used a lot of time on this. We have a lot of shit to get through, so we better keep going. Sorry, Jane, go.
Yeah, so sprinkled all throughout this versioning process, we have conformance tests, and then we have an upcoming thing called conformance profiles. So Gateway API Conformance has multiple levels. They go with like the channels. So we have core, which if you want to say that you do a thing, you have to implement and pass all of the core tests. Extended has some tests that, or some features that are, this is not like experimental. We can actually, in the standard, we may have extended features which are opt-inable. You don't have to opt into them. And these are features that, like for core, it's every implementation can do it. And for extended, it's some implementations can do it. And then implementation specific, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, it's all right.
For implementation specific, we kind of this is more us just tracking that there are things that might be kind of really outside of our boundaries, but we want to make sure that they're kind of acknowledged in Gateway API, but no actual conformance tests, or at least probably not. There's been talks about maybe having some like really high level tests or something like that, but I don't know if it's ever going to happen. So the features are defined with a conformance level. So yeah, each feature can have this. Objects can have tests at different conformance levels. So like we have gateway class, gateway and HTTP routes. They can all have core and extended tests that you can opt into with features. And then
I'd say probably one thing I would say there is that core extended and implementation specific is actually a dimension for implementers, like more than users, right? So like users it's relevant for users in the sense that if you want this extended feature, at some point we want to have a matrix that shows you the extended features, and you can see a tick which implementations support that extended feature. That's the sort of the dream.
Yeah. And then we're working on conformance profiles, which is basically on top of the conformance tests. It enables like subscriptable names like HTTP, TLS, and mesh. And these are actually the initial ones that we're working on. And then a reporting mechanism. So before it was just conformance tests, you could use the test suite like a Go library or a CLI and just run the tests on your implementation. Now you'll be able to use profiles, which will give you kind of just a higher level thing that you can do. And these will result in actual reports that can then be submitted upstream as part of our upcoming certification process. So we don't know exactly how all of that looks just yet. In fact, that QR code will get you to the GEP, which is Gateway Enhancement Proposal. It's very similar to KEP, but for Gateway API. And it's in a prototyping stage, which is kind of just, there's a prototype available, but we're not sure of it yet. We're going through that kind of early cycle of like testing things out and see how they work. And then as that progresses, we expect to do some things like we're talking about we have an issue open for recording conformance results in gateway class status. That is so that things can programmatically understand what things you actually subscribe to, what features you have, what tests you actually run, that sort of thing. Status displays, the current thinking is that we have an implementations page with like our 20 plus implementations of Gateway API. that we would have some widgets on there that would effectively do like a high-level status showing what people's levels of conformance are based on the reports. And then later automation, like right now we're kind of aiming for having this be a fairly manual thing that implementers like go and run the test, get the file, upload it to us, and then maybe later we can add automation on top of that. So
Yeah, I think that the dream is something like what Kubernetes itself has for conformance, where a distribution, or in our case, an implementation, can say, we are conformant to Gateway API version 7.0.0 or something like that. Right? And so we want to be able to give people badges that they can show to say yes, Gateway API thumbs up, and it's all proved.
yeah. So if you're interested, that's the GEP link, and that number 1709 is the actual issue on our repo too, if you want to get involved and like check that out. So we wanted to do a shout out here. We have a sub-project of our sub-project called GAMMA, which is for service mesh. And if you're interested in service mesh, we actually just within the last couple of weeks got our first service mesh conformance test just to try it out, just to see like using HTTP route and stuff like that in a service mesh context, and east-west traffic instead of north-south traffic. It's all very experimental. We're just kind of prototyping it and checking things out. But if you're interested in that, we have a GAMMA meeting every week, and the tests are already in the repository. You can kind of check that out. But just, it's subject to change, so just keep that in mind. Anything you want to add to that? No. Okay.
Okay, we are like already starting lunch, so I'm going to try and keep this as quick as possible. This one will take me a little bit to get through though. Okay, so if you've been watching Gateway API at all, you probably are aware that we've had this idea called policy attachment for some time. I did a PR a little while ago to try and update this to make it more understandable. It was a bit hard to understand before. Still pretty hard to understand, but I think it's better, hopefully. So yeah, one of the things I wanted to do there was to come up with a word that describes what policy attachment does, and that's meta-resource. A meta-resource is just any object that attaches to another object and like modifies its function. So it's like a decorator for a function. A meta-resource alters the functioning of another Kubernetes resource. A policy attachment is a meta-resource that uses a specific targeting struct and targets another resource and changes its behavior somehow. The target ref struct is the one there, that we define that in Gateway API. But the policy itself can be either direct or inherited. Now, the idea here is to allow gateway objects and stuff that's sort of in the gateway ecosystem to be able to mess with objects that you can't normally mess with. To be able to decorate stuff like service or secret that you can't change the spec of very easily, and we can prototype ways to do stuff like, say, in my direct example here, the backend TLS policy or some similar, name TBD, don't quote me. But the idea here is to have some way to describe like a gateway proxy needs to connect to a backend that does its own TLS. How does the gateway proxy know what TLS settings to use? And you can't, the logical place for that is the service, right? But service is already too big, too magic, so we want to find some other way to do it. The idea here is to have a direct policy attachment that is a one-to-one object that you create that attaches to a specific service instance that says, this service has these TLS properties. It uses this CA, it expects this TLS version, or something like that. So that's the type of this is a slightly more simple version of the original proposal, which was the inherited one. Lucas, did you have a question? No, it is not a sub-resource. So Lucas asked, is it a sub-resource? It is not a sub-resource. It is a completely separate resource. So backend TLS policy will be its own CRD that then targets a core service. And implementations then need to know to watch for this type of CRD and take actions based on the fact if it's present and pointing to a service that is referred to by a HTTP route. So a much more complicated but useful, hopefully, thing is inherited policy attachment. This is the original design. This is one where you can attach an object to something that's in a hierarchy, and then the settings flow down the hierarchy in some way. It supports either defaults or overrides. Defaults are exactly what it says. You can specify, the idea here is you can specify, the canonical example that I'm still working on is timeouts for a gateway. The idea here is that you can attach a timeout policy to a gateway and say, okay, request timeout for every HTTP route. The default is 10 seconds or whatever. And then individual HTTP routes can override that by attaching their own policy to a specific HTTP route, setting the default there. Alternatively, if you are someone who is managing a shared proxy, you may want to override and say, you can do any timeout you like, but you can't do an infinite request timeout, because that's terrible, right? So that's what the overrides are for. So they enforce values all the way down, and the higher up in the hierarchy you are, the more likely you are to succeed, to win. Yo.
Hi, thank you. Does this mean that the validation for these objects lower down this stack depends on everything else that's applied?
So the idea here is to generally use these to control something that's not in the spec already of those objects. So it's like, that's why augments is the word that I chose. It was pretty carefully chosen. So the idea here is that you won't have a timeout field in HTTP route, but you can use the policy thing to effectively, it's like a side channel way to configure things that aren't in the spec. Maybe we'll change that. I think there's another interaction that's possible, that if you have a custom filter, because there is an extension point where you can plug in your own CRD for a filter on a HTTP route, you might want to configure defaults for that filter at a gateway level for each time when you use it. A good example here is an OIDC filter or something like that. Maybe you want to be able to be like, hey, if you're doing OIDC, you do it this way, and all you got to do is add the filter with no config, and you'll get the defaults. That's what this policy attachment stuff is for. To be clear, it hasn't been used much yet. It is still a concept rather than an actual in-use design. Sorry. Okay.
I was just going to say, what I'm really getting at is this going to lead to a problem where the behavior of a system depends on the order in which you apply resources, which you kind of get now with CRDs, where if you don't apply the CRD definitions first, everything breaks?
It is definitely a good concern. I am hopeful that we should make it that it shouldn't do that, because if you apply a new resource at a different level, it means the whole system needs to be recomputed, which already is the case for Gateway API. If you apply another HTTP route, you actually need to recompute you need to go up to the gateway and then recompute all the HTTP routes that are attached to that gateway in case there's a conflict already. So it's not that different. However, there is, you lead me very well onto my next slide, thank you. There is a huge problem, and that is discoverability. If you have all of these side channels, if you are a HTTP route owner, how do you know what side channels are applying? It turns out this is really hard. This is a really hard problem to solve. We have not got a good solution for it yet, although we have a couple of options. So yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to tell people about this is to say, hey, this is a thing we're doing, and we need help here. So if you have any ideas about this, please talk to me about it. Yeah.
Yes, one more question related to this. So I suppose this creates a problem when I'm writing the controller that will reconcile this resource. Then first, obviously, if I apply resources in a different order, than the one that is expected, I might have issues. And secondly, if I am the controller, I have to retrieve all of these resources from the cluster, right? So isn't this a scalability problem?
So yeah, you got to watch more resources, yes. So you can create scalability problems. The idea here is to make it so that implementations can choose which things that matter to them and only watch the things that matter to them. All of this stuff is only ever going to be extended, right? This stuff will never be core. You'll never have to do it. It'll be, if your implementation is trying to solve problems that you need defaults or overrides for, then maybe you support an inherited policy attachment, right? That's the idea here, is to make these are extension points, but standardized extension points. To go back to sort of the overall goals of Gateway API, one of the biggest things that we're trying to do here is to avoid the 200 annotations on ingress problem, right? And so we want to have lots of ways that you can do your own thing, but to make it a standard way that you can do your own thing.
So that's interesting. Have you considered the WASM kind of stuff that?
Yeah. So
has been used?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm hopeful that there should be some crossover at some point between some of this and some of the stuff that's coming with WASM. I have been too busy to really keep up with it very well, but I know that it is coming. So yes, I'm hopeful that there should be some crossover here, and we should be able to do implementations should be able to do some cool stuff with it. If you're working on that sort of stuff, I would love to hear about it. Yeah, we are super low on time though, so can I roll on? We've got one more big sort of thing to talk about, and that is ReferenceGrant headed to core. I'm trying to get this as quick as you can so you can go have lunch, I'm sorry. ReferenceGrant and Gateway API is a way to more securely do cross namespace references. When we built the gateway and HTTP route interaction, people wanted to be able to do that across namespaces. However, pretty much everything in Kubernetes is built with the idea that you don't do cross namespace references. And the thing that we realized is that in order to be able to, as safely as possible, do cross namespace references, you need to have a handshake. You know, somebody needs to have one person needs to initiate the handshake, and then a person at the other end needs to accept the handshake, right? And so that's the idea behind ReferenceGrant for Gateway API, is that if you want to have a HTTP route that references a service that is in another namespace, you can do that in the HTTP route struct. It will let you, but the service will not be used unless in the namespace where the service is, there is a ReferenceGrant allowing access from HTTP routes from wherever the original reference was. So it's like, this is the other, ReferenceGrant is the other half of the handshake. So, you know, we found it pretty useful to be able to do this. It turns out that other people are too. Yeah, SIG storage folks, thank you very much. They have already started using ReferenceGrant for some SIG storage concepts. And so, you know, Rob has done a lot of the work here to kick off the thing, but about maybe trying to bring this ReferenceGrant idea into the core somehow, which we started off the process. The GEP is actually, that KEP is actually merged as provisional. However, it got complicated. And it got complicated because it's a good idea that people want to see done right. And in Gateway API, we had a limited scope. It was less generic than what core is going to need it for. And so there's a bunch of changes that, that we're looking at doing in Upstream, like, you know, making sure that you have read access to the things that you're granting access to. Seems like a no-brainer, right? Like, but it's actually a bit tricky. You know, removing spec and, you know, making sure we have a shared library to simplify implementations for people, all this sort of stuff. Because this is going to be in core as opposed to a CRD, it's a slightly different story. There's a bunch of open questions here about, like, should we let people have verbs on there? So you can say, this ReferenceGrant is only valid for network traffic or for making, you know, reading a secret or for other things. That's in the current proposal, right, Rob? That what the verb's on? Yeah. Yes. There is a PR that suggests adding that. Thanks, Rob. Yeah. Yeah, so.
Yeah, we're trying to discuss this afternoon in just around a table somewhere, but trying to work out these issues. This involves SIG storage, SIG auth, and of course, Gateway API. So we're all here. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you are interested in this, please come and see one of us about it, Shane Roberoy. But yeah, I think we are well and truly over time. So if anyone has any questions about this, yeah, speak now. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we got one. Yeah.
Actually, we too are from SIG storage. That means
hey, respect.
this feature.
Mad props.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So I'm looking at to discuss this topic.
Yeah, fantastic.
Afternoon.
Cool.
Thank you.
Okay, awesome. You got one, Lucas? No? Okay. So yeah. So we left space for questions, but we've done them already. So thank you, everybody, and you should all go eat lunch while you can.